my name is Chris Yee and I'm making a 3D puzzle platformer called Nectar. In the game, you play as a potted sunflower with his bumblebee companion, using globs of nectar to grow plants and manipulate the world. I've been working on the game for about 6 months now, and I've made a lot of progress. In this video, I'm going to talk about the 3 C's. The concept for the 3 C's was planted in my mind after I watched devlogs for the indie games Paper Clay and Gooby. You should definitely check out their games, they look fantastic. The 3 C's stand for the camera, the controller, and the character. And I'm going to talk about how I improved these 3 things over the past 6 months of development. Let's start with camera. So early versions of my camera were very zoomed into my character, to the point where the character pretty much just took up the entire screen. And I was watching some GDC talks, and one of the speakers was talking about camera, and he said that it's much better to zoom out, increase the field of view so the player can assess the environment and figure out where they are. It helps them orient themselves. Especially in a puzzle game like mine, I want them to be able to survey the area and figure out what they need to do, where things are. So I zoomed out the camera. I also shifted the camera up a little bit so that the focal spot is above the character, not the character himself. And after making this change, I could immediately see it was better. Some other changes I made was adding some camera lag. It's very subtle. There's a very small amount of lag, but it helps make the camera less stiff feeling when you're moving around. And then one thing that the devlogs of Paper Clay and Gooby talked about when they were talking about the 3 C's and the camera was jumping, because their games are platformers. Mine is a puzzle platformer. So the platforming isn't the main focus of it, but there is platforming. And what they pointed out in their devlogs is that the camera was following their character as they jumped, and it strictly stuck to them as they jumped. And when it does that, you can't see the ground anymore after you jump, which is detrimental for platforming itself. You need to be able to see the ground. So their solution was to keep the camera stationary when you jump, and then when you land, if you jump onto a higher platform, then the camera follows you after that, after you land. If you don't, if you land back on the ground that you started on, then the camera doesn't move at all. I did add a little bit of movement when you jump, just to add a little player feedback. It's very subtle again, it moves just a tiny bit when you jump. It follows the character up and then goes back down a little bit. And then one more thing I did for the camera movement is when you're using a controller and you are walking sideways, originally the camera didn't move at all. It just pointed straight ahead while you walked sideways. And this felt very unresponsive to the player. It just felt stiff. And to fix this, I add a very small amount of rotation when you're walking to the left. So if you're walking to the left, the camera will sort of auto-adjust to rotate somewhat behind the character a little bit, just a very small amount. And this just makes the camera feel way more responsive. I don't do it when the player is using a keyboard and mouse, because I found that the player is constantly just moving the mouse around and it contradicts the auto movement and you're sort of just fighting the auto movement. So I took it away for the keyboard and mouse, but it feels much better on the controller now that there's some of that auto rotating. That was all the camera movement I added, but I did add a few more, I guess you could call them effects to the camera. So one thing I was running into was obstacle avoidance for the camera, and I still haven't fully solved this, but one of the solutions I came up with was fading some of the objects. So if I walk near a tree and the tree is going to obscure my view, then I fade the tree a little bit and it kind of gradually fades out. I use a dithering effect instead of actual transparency, just because it's a little better on performance, but the dithering allows you to see the character through the tree and it doesn't obscure your view. Now this isn't always going to work with other obstacles. For example, if I'm at a wall or like a cliff or something and I don't want the player seeing through the cliff, I haven't come up with a solution for that yet. The camera currently just rams into the wall and zooms super close into the character, which isn't ideal. I might try to implement some sort of ray casting to detect obstacles and then gradually zoom in instead of immediately zooming in. That might be better, but I haven't implemented that yet. And then one of the other things I did with the camera was less of a functional thing, it was more of an aesthetics thing. But I added some depth of field, so things in the background are a little blurry. I played around with the settings. I didn't want them to be too blurry because it is a puzzle game. I want people to be able to see parts of the puzzle far off in the distance so they know where things are. But I did add a little bit of blur just to make you feel smaller, make the world feel bigger. I think it adds a layer of polish to the look that it didn't have before that. So that's the camera. That's one of the C's. The second C I'm going to cover is the controller. Now this is a very important part of the game, how the player controls the character. And I really wanted to focus hard on this. I wanted to nail down the feel of the character before I got too far into development, because if it doesn't feel good to control the character, then the game isn't going to be fun. So one of the things I played around with was the walk speed. In the beginning, I had a fairly slow walk speed because I thought it would add some weight to the character, I guess. And then I had a sprint button, so you walk slow and then if you push a button, then you'd sprint. And I had it like this for a while, but then I heard some advice from someone saying that if there's no reason for you to not push a button, then it should just be automatic. And while I was testing the game, I found that I was just always holding the sprint button. There's really no reason for me not to hold it, so I figured I should just make that automatic. I should just increase the walk speed. There's no reason that the character needs to walk that slow. So I ditched the sprint button altogether, and now the character just always runs. So that's walking and running. For the character's jump, I played around with the jump height and settled in around 4 character heights as the jump height. And then I also put in variable jump height. So if you hold down the jump button, you do the full jump. But if you only tap the jump button, you don't jump as high. The way I achieved this was the same amount of jump force is applied when you hit the button, and then when you release the button, it cuts your vertical velocity in half. And I wanted the jump to feel somewhat heavy. I wanted the character to have some weight to him. So in order to do this, while he's jumping, once he reaches the peak of his jump, gravity on the character actually increases. So the arc of the jump isn't a symmetrical arc. There's a steep increase after the peak of the jump. And this makes the jump feel way more snappy, makes the character feel better when you're jumping around, which is important when you're platforming. Another thing to make the platforming a little better is I added a drop shadow. So I got rid of the actual shadow caused from the lighting on the character model, and instead I put a decal of just a little circle underneath the character, and whenever you jump, this decal follows you around. And this is so that you can tell exactly where the character is going to land. In a 3D space, it's pretty difficult with depth perception to tell where the character is going to land, and this is just another step to help with that. And just to add a little layer of polish to it, I made it so that when you jump, the decal gets a little smaller, and then when you get closer to the ground, it grows back to its original scale. I also implemented an automatic ledge climb. So every time you jump, there's a line trace that detects if there's a wall in front of you, and then if there is a wall in front of you, it detects how high up the top of the wall is from you. And if it's close enough, then it activates a ledge climbing animation, which is just this little flip thing. Originally, I was going to have you hang off of the ledge, but given how short the character's arms are, that would look a little weird, and also, I figured there's no reason not to just make it automatic. I don't think there's really any situation where you wouldn't want to climb the ledge. This is kind of a way to make the platforming a little more forgiving. If you didn't jump far enough, but you're close, then the ledge climb will kind of save you. And I played around with how this ledge climb worked a lot. Initially, it felt like it just completely stopped the momentum of the player whenever it happened. So I ended up adding a small boost of force every time that it happens. So when you flip up and land, then a small force pushes you forward. It's subtle, but it helps keep the sense of momentum. I've been having some issues with when the ledge climb activates. So sometimes it activates randomly when I don't want it to. It's rare, but it does happen every once in a while. And then sometimes it doesn't activate it when I do want it to. And the character just ends up stuck in a falling animation for a little bit while they're stuck against the ledge. I haven't really figured out a way to fix these things yet, but I'm still tweaking it, still trying to figure it out, so if you have any suggestions for solutions, leave them in the comments. I currently have one line trace going forward from the character, and then 3 line traces going upwards in front of the character, kind of on an arc around the character. And if it detects a ledge, then it snaps the player perpendicular to the wall that it detects. This sort of solved the ledge climb activating on its own when I didn't want it to, but it didn't completely eliminate it. It still happens every once in a while. I also played around with the character's walk acceleration and deceleration. There's a slight buildup of momentum before you reach full speed, and there's also a slight deceleration before you stop running. This, again, helps to add weight to the character. I did the same thing with turn speed, so the character doesn't immediately turn 180 if you do that. It's more gradual. And then one more important thing with the platforming, which is, I guess, something that's pretty common in platformers, but I saw it in a GMTK video about Celeste, actually. They talk about something called jump buffer and something called coyote time. And these are basically just to make the platforming a little less punishing, so you don't have to be pixel perfect with your button presses. So normally when you're jumping, you can only jump when you're on the ground. That makes sense. Real world, you can't jump unless you're on the ground. But what that results in is that if you happen to push the button just a split second before you hit the ground, you won't jump, you'll just stand there. And that feels bad, because it feels like you hit the button, it feels like you should jump, but you don't actually jump, it feels unresponsive. So a jump buffer is the few fractions of seconds before you hit the ground. If you hit the jump button in that time, it will remember that you pressed the jump button, and when you hit the ground, you'll jump. So it gives a little more buffer for your jump, the jump buffer. Coyote time is the opposite of that. So if you're running off a ledge and you happen to hit the jump button a split second after you run off the ledge, instead of not allowing the character to jump because you were off of the ledge, it'll allow you to jump for just a split second after you've run off the ledge, to be a little more forgiving with the platforming. My character blueprint is pretty complicated right now. There are nodes going everywhere. It's kind of a mess when you look at it. I did already go through one pass of simplifying everything. It used to be worse than this, and I was having trouble actually finding things, and I decided I needed to go through and simplify some things. I put things into functions and categorized them a little bit more. I added some comments so it's easier to find things, and I did simplify it a lot. It is still a little more complicated than I would like. Maybe I'll end up doing another pass at some point to simplify it a little more. But at the moment it works for me. I can find things when I need to. And there's a lot of stuff in here that are mechanics I've sort of abandoned, but I want to keep in there just in case I want to add them back in. But eventually I'll probably just end up deleting them. I've gotten a lot better at programming since I started this project. So if I made this character blueprint again from scratch, it would probably be a lot better, a lot more organized. But the way it is right now, it still works for me. I can still do what I want with it, so I'm going to leave it for now, and if it becomes a problem later, then I'll go through and fix it. So those were the camera and the controller. The last to see is the character. Now, you've seen lots and lots of video of my character at this point. Still doesn't have a name. I'll come up with the name eventually. Right now I'm just kind of calling him Plant Man or Sunflower Man. Plant Man's easier to say, so Plant Man it is. If you have suggestions for names, I'm open to them. But how did I come up with this Plant Man? The answer is I didn't. Plant Man was actually the brainchild of my girlfriend. So one day she was just talking on the phone and doodling while she was talking, and after she hung up, she showed me the little drawing she did, and it was this drawing of this cute little plant guy. And I looked at it and I was like, this would be a really good character for something. I didn't know at that point that I was going to be making a video game. But when I did decide to make a video game, that character stuck in my mind. And I jumped into Blender, I modeled him up, and threw him into Unreal, and there he is. Now, the bee wasn't in the original design, the bumblebee. The bee came about because the design of the Plant Man kind of restricted his animations. I'm not great with animation in general to begin with, so if I can limit the number of animations I have to do, the better the game will probably be. But just in general, his arms are too short to grab things and hold things, and I knew that I needed the character to be able to hold things. So I thought about maybe like, it's a plant man, so maybe his arms can grow as plants, but that was a little weird and that would probably be more challenging. So I added a bumblebee companion. The bumblebee can just fly around, pick things up, and it has the added bonus now of if you approach something that is interactable, it can hover over that thing so that you know that you can interact with it. So that's how I came up with Plantman and Bumblebee. I don't have a name for the bumblebee either, so again, suggestions. To add a little bit of dynamic character to the Plantman, I decided to make him blink, and I decided to make him look in random directions. So every few seconds, he closes his eyes, looks in a different direction, closes his eyes, look in a different direction, closes his eyes, look in a different direction. And the bee also randomly positions himself around the sunflower every few seconds. Now, the walk-run cycle is pretty basic. Like I said, I'm not an animator, really. I have animated things before, and I can sort of do walk cycles, so I went into Blender and I made a walk cycle. I think it came out pretty good. The run cycle as well. I think the run cycle is better than the walk cycle, which is convenient because my character is running all the time now. I also made a falling animation, which is basically just him flailing his arms. He also has an idle animation where he kind of just bobs up and down. I do want to make a waiting animation for if you don't push anything, then he kind of does something. I haven't done that yet, but that is on the list of things to do. And then just a few more things to add a little bit of polish to the character, because he felt stiff, even with all the changes that I've made. The character model felt stiff, and that's because it was stiff. In the beginning, I kind of purposefully kept his body rigid just because he's a potted plant, so in real life they don't really like jiggle or move around very much because he's a hard material. But I felt like he was just a little too stiff. So I added some squash and stretch, and even though it's not really realistic, it does end up adding a lot of character, I think, to the Plantman. So when he runs, his body kind of bounces up and down with the weight of his run. When he jumps, he stretches out while he's going up, and then when he's coming down, he squashes a little bit, and then when he hits the ground, he squashes even more. And it's really quick, but your eye catches it, and I think it makes it feel more alive. I also added some cloth simulation to the petals of the sunflower, so when the player moves, there's a little bit of wobble when the flower moves around, and this just makes the character feel a little more dynamic, less static, more believable. And then I also added dust particles. The dust particles are really just a bunch of sphere meshes kind of mushed together, and then they're put into a particle system that is emitted every time you're running, and then those sphere meshes kind of shrink and then disappear, and it looks like dust. So I added those when you're running, and I also added those when you're jumping and when you're landing and hitting the ground. It adds a lot of impact to your jump that wasn't there before. And that's everything I've done in regards to the 3Cs over the past 6 months. So I'll just put a little clip of early footage to show off some of the early gameplay in terms of the controller, the character, and the camera right here. And then to compare, here's the new version of the character, controller, and camera. So I think I've made some pretty good improvements. This is obviously an ongoing thing, so I might tweak things as I go. This definitely isn't the final version, but it's definitely better. And I've started to grow pretty attached to this Plantman. I really need to name him soon. If you like this video and you want to know more about this game, I've made a few other videos about this game, covering other topics that I've developed over the past 6 months. I have videos where I talk about the environment, the art style, the sound design, the different mechanics that I'm developing in the game. So if you're interested in any of that, check out my channel, they're already out. And if you want to hear more about this game, subscribe and hit the bell, and you'll be notified of future videos. I have a Steam page as well, so you can check that out and wishlist the game. And if you want to be part of the community, I also have a Discord server. Thanks.